Hey everybody, Plushie here. So I've been getting a lot of requests for making a video on 90++ nodes and how to farm them, and I've been pushing back on that idea, and today I guess I'll make a very short video explaining why I feel like 90++ is such a difficult topic to tackle, and it is much better to treat them as individual case by case whenever we evaluate them, rather than having one big video encompass as much information as possible, because that would be way too much and it will be impossible to finish. So what is a 90++ node, you might ask? Actually, you might not ask, because NA already got it in the current Summer 7 event. It is basically a higher difficulty farming node that is above 90+, and it's characterized by usually having weird numbered enemy lineups. So for example, the current one has a 1-1-1 across all three waves, so single targets are really good, but obviously there will be a mix of singular high HP targets and multiple enemy targets in the future, just to make your farming a little bit more diverse. And there are even 90++ that only have 2 waves, which coincidentally, the next 90++ during the Rikyu Guda Guda event is only a 2-wave 90++. So it is very diverse in terms of enemy lineup. And usually the end boss HP lands at around 600,000 to a million. Obviously that depends on the event. If the event has a damage CE, sometimes they will bump up the HP by a little bit, but usually you can predict it to be around that ballpark. And another big thing about 90++ is their singular big targets in Wave 1 and Wave 2 also can have very high HP, sometimes even all the way up to 300,000. And this can definitely mess with your traditional farming teams, and this is why a lot of people are a little bit worried about 90++. And this is also what makes 90++ more interesting, at least in my opinion, in terms of forcing you to make more diverse team builds. So now back to the question of why is a video tutorial on 90++ so difficult to make? And when I hear the terms 90++ tutorial, I assume it's mostly about how to build a team to farm 90++. And here are a couple of reasons why I think it is extremely difficult to generalize all of that within one video. First and foremost, anti-traits are a lot more prevalent in 90++. Anti-traits obviously help in all forms of farming, even in 90+ or lower difficulty ones, but a lot of the times back in the day you don't really need that extra damage push, and you can just brute force it with the powerful meta supports, and especially Oberon when comboed with Black Grail. However, with the new standard of HP in 90++, anti-trait starts to become extremely relevant, and it's very difficult to tell you what kind of anti-trait that you should own just for 90++ farming. In most cases, it's more gonna be like, oh, I happen to have this DPS that I really like, also hit anti-trait against this 90++, great, I'm going to have an easy time against this specific event. But that's not going to be the case for following events necessarily. Obviously, I can tell you about what anti-traits are technically better, because there are more widely distributed traits compared to some others. For example, anti-earth is considered a very good anti-trait because it's widely distributed among servants and non-servants alike. But once again, it's a bit different from saying you should own anti-earth servants for the sake of 90++. The second reason why it's so difficult to talk about 90++ team building is because brute forcing with a single core DPS don't always work anymore. So obviously we have the problem of the enemy numbers being weird, so you can't always have enough refund with arts looping, and if arts looping can't refund enough, quick looping isn't gonna have any chance. And you might say, oh, then just use buster looping then, because buster looping doesn't really care about enemy numbers. However, remember when I said that there are many 90++ nodes that have high HP single target enemies in earlier waves, and that is probably the biggest threat posed against buster looping. Because one of buster looping's biggest damage sources is actually your ability to double cast your main DPS's steroid when using Koyanskaya of Light. And because of most of those steroids being cooldown 6, usually the damage peaks a lot higher on the third wave for buster looping. Of course, when you add an Oberon, it peaks even higher. But on the first 2 waves, Buster looping, especially for loopers that don't have the ability to use Black Grill, which is most of them, they're not going to be having too much damage. And when that happens, usually you either have to rely on face cards or the looping just fails. So it's very difficult to brute force certain 90++ nodes. And this is when multi-core gets brought into the picture. So multi-core almost feels like a buzzword being thrown around the community, and it can sound very vague and weird at times, but essentially what it means is just having multiple DPSs in your team instead of just using one like the traditional looping comps. And in my opinion, there are 2 main types of multi-cores that people really need to understand to distinguish between. The first type of multi-core usually consists of multiple AoE units, maybe a single target unit mixed in, and they also usually have a bunch of party-wide spread charges. And usually the way they farm is just using 3 separate MPs on each wave. Some common examples being double Tezcali Polka, double Koyanskaya of Dark, and so on. These types of multi-core farming usually aren't better than single core looping. They don't provide more damage on each wave, and usually if you can do the node with this type of multi-core team, you will be able to single core loop it quite easily. The purpose of these teams are to save time and save bond, because a lot of people already have their meta supports at really high bond levels, and also there's a lot of button clicking, and also plug suit is usually involved in single core looping, unlike these types of farming teams where you usually are just using 3 MPs in a row. Those types of multi-core farming teams usually aren't relevant in 90++. There are obviously exceptions. For example, characters such as Tai Kobo can thrive in this type of multi-core farming in 90++, but that simply is because of how incredibly hard he hits divine targets. And that is still under the assumption that he is also hitting counterclass. The second type of multi-core are usually consists of an AoE, a single target, and 1 to 2 meta supports, and usually plug suit is still involved. These types of multi-core farming teams are the ones that are more prevalent in 90++, and the purpose of these teams existing is because of the high HP single target enemies on earlier waves where you're not able to tackle with your AoE, and you have to go and rely on a single target instead. And this kind of team building further complicates the discussion of how can I team build for 90++, because obviously this once again very much rely on what the enemy formations are and what your roster looks like. Essentially what you're doing with this kind of comps is splashing in a single target into a kind of standard looping comp, especially if you're using like an AoE arts, for example. And because of that, a lot of the times those single targets also are even more reliant on anti-trait than your AoE, because you're forced to dump your steroids card type buffs onto your AoE in order for them to have enough refund for certain waves, so your single target is left relying on their own kit for damage. So this further worsens the problem of discussing 90++ being roster dependent. Like obviously I can tell you what single targets are considered pretty great in multi-core. Characters such as Draco, who has wide coveraging anti-servant, characters such as Kintoki, who just has immense amount of damage despite having no anti-traits, and characters with big batteries in general are considered good, but still, you can often see characters such as Skahak, who only has 20 battery, being splashed into your multi-core farming team simply because only she has enough anti-divine damage to take down that one big enemy on wave 2. Another reason why I feel like 90++ is so difficult to generalize is because it's also very event dependent. So ever since a certain point of the game's life cycle, Lysenko has been adding a lot more events that have damage bonus CEs that also starts with 50 MP charge. This can greatly affect the effectiveness of certain 90++ teams. For example, single core buster looping becomes a lot better because there are a lot of powerhouse AoE buster units that have to loop with a starting charge CE, so they aren't as effective usually because they don't have the ability to equip Black Grail. However, during those events, they can basically run free. Characters such as Kukulkan, Morgan, and Arjuna Alter are decent examples. And this further complicates the problem when you take multi-core into consideration. Who do I even put this damage CE on? Do I put it on the single target? Or do I put it on the AoE? Obviously that depends on, who is the main focus for this comp. Do I include 2 of them in my comp and not MLB it, so both of them start with 30 MP charge, but I lose out on 2 drop bonuses? This is another compounding factor that makes talking about 90++ team building extremely difficult. So after all that incoherent rambling, I might have made 90++ sound like this evil addition to the game that makes farming unnecessarily complicated. So here's a couple of silver linings, at least in my opinion. So first of all, I actually think forcing you to innovate when building a farming team is a good thing, because farming traditionally has been really dull and it's basically just looking at looping spreadsheets. You might as well not be playing the game. But now with 90++, at the very least when you first come up with your farming team, especially when you're building multi-core teams, it is extremely interesting to try to work out a team that works with what you have. And when you eventually come up with that comp, it's very satisfying. One of the greatest examples I love to bring up is the Takasugi White Days 90++, where it seems extremely daunting at first because the first wave enemy is a 600,000 HP berserker, but then people realized how easy it is to insta-kill, so people started using Dolman in combination with the insta-kill Mystic Code, and it became one of the easiest 90++s to farm without even having to use Plug Suit. The second silver lining is, of course, 90++ now allows you to use a larger part of your servant roster. You can start to use your single targets in your farming nodes, and even though this already is a trend in 90+, most people still just brute force. But now, because you don't have the option to brute force every time anymore, you might actually have the opportunity to use some of your favorite quote-unquote boss killers in farming and get their bond up instead of just throwing them into the backline. 90++ also allows you to be extremely AP efficient, and clearing event shops with natural AP is easier than ever. And since you're only doing 5 to 6 runs at most per day from natural AP, you're not really caring too much whether you're doing these 90++s within 3 turns or you're taking more turns. And even for events where this technically matters, which is of course lotto events, I still don't think it matters as much as you might think, because you gotta ask yourself realistically, how many boxes do you really need to farm? And if the answer is I don't actually have to farm an insane amount of boxes because I don't absolutely roll for everything in the game, then it shouldn't be that much of a problem if you're not able to farm the 90++ within 3 turns. Obviously, you can of course also go back to farming 90+ within 3 turns. So it just comes down to AP efficiency versus time efficiency. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is sort of a sudden idea that just popped up in my head. So it might seem a little bit messy, but hope this is entertaining, and I'll see you guys in the next one.